So you've made a really strong case for the connection between joy and relationships and sexuality. But let's be honest, it might not be the best thing to go into a youth group and say, oh man, joy and sexuality, that's the thing. So how do you approach youth groups with this conversation around joy and sexuality?
Well, before we get to the nuts and bolts of how to do these things in youth group, let's talk a little bit about the disconnect that we feel when we say joy and sexuality in a Christian context.
Okay.
I think for many, many years in our Christian tradition, we have been afraid, scared, nervous to allow a conversation about sexuality and joy to happen. Partly that's because of our Christian history and our traditions around sexuality. Very early Christians were working with Jewish traditions, Greek and Roman traditions, and there was a disconnect between how we understood the flesh and the spirit. And so for a long time, we've struggled with how to put those together. Now, a theology of joy is about emotional attunement and tells us we are embodied spiritual beings. We cannot leave our bodies behind. They help us celebrate. They are where we feel. They are where we experience joy. So if we're going to talk about sexuality and a theology of joy, it's got to be embodied. We've got to keep the body and the spirit together, and we can't deny the body in that aspect. It's also incarnational, right? I mean, that's at the root of our Christian tradition, is that Jesus came in an embodied form. God knows what it means to be in a body, both the suffering and pain, but also the joy of it. So keeping those together, we have to let go our nervousness about the flesh, especially when it's teenagers' flesh. I think the other aspect is that what came out of that tradition was also a deep concern and even notion of sinfulness around sexual desire. So sexual desire became this slippery slope that we cannot fight against, that we should just try to keep ourselves totally covered and unaware of sexual desire altogether so that we do not sin. But if God made our sexuality and God made our sexual responses as part of that, then sexual desire is a normal part of our lives. And the sooner we make our teenagers aware of that, our politicians aware of that, we might be able to say, okay, I can experience sexual desire and not act on it, right? And so part of understanding that joy means we want it to continue. If I experience the joy of sexual desire, then I know that I can't act wrongly with regard to it, that I can't act against someone else's will because of it, because that good will not continue. Then, in fact, I have committed a sin. So I think we also need to revision what we mean by understanding of sexual desire and its connection to our body and relate it to the acts and the behaviors we do, not so much the fact that it's automatically bad. And that brings me to the last point of Christian theology, that it was easier and has been easier over time for us just to create rules about certain behaviors without actually asking ourselves, do those behaviors enhance joy or inhibit joy? So, for example, the Christian tradition for many, many years has said that sexual intercourse that produces children is good. And in some religious traditions, that's one of the only reasons to engage in sexual intercourse. But we know from many, many studies of married couples, of non-married couples, that sexual experiences with one another actually bond us, that they reduce stress. There are all kinds of goods that come from sexual behaviors, and teenagers know that. So us hiding that fact does not help anything. Why not think about, does this behavior actually enhance joy or inhibit it? Does it help us live out our values of consent, of mutuality? Or does it not? Would we just say that anytime someone's having sexual intercourse to have a baby, it's a good thing? Probably not. We want to know what's the context of that relationship, what are the values being exhibited in that relationship. So it's really the values that drive whether we're seeing joy enhanced or inhibited. It's not the specific behaviors. So a huge part of talking about sexuality and joy with teenagers is letting go of some of our Christian history and tradition that has prevented us from seeing the ways in which Sexuality is about embodiment. Joy is about embodiment. Knowing our feelings and emotions, being able to understand sexual desire but not act on it, is part of emotional attunement, which is a key part of joy. And lastly, it's about living out our values in relationship with one another. It's not about predetermining what particular behaviors are right or wrong.